Before the drones, before the night vision goggles, before warfare became something conducted from computer screens thousands of miles away, there existed a form of combat so primitive and terrifying that even hardened soldiers spoke of it in whispers. In the frozen trenches of the Western Front, men volunteered to crawl through darkness, armed with clubs and knives, descending into enemy positions to kill silently and vanish like ghosts. This is the story of one such night, when 20 men crossed into hell and only 19 returned. January 10th, 1917, 11:45 at night. Calonne sector, Western Front, 6 miles northeast of Arras, France. The man they pulled from the German trench that night, in January 1917, had no face left to speak of. British Lieutenant Arthur Grimshaw watched as 2 of his raiders dragged the body into the muddy communication trench. The German soldier's features obliterated by a close-range blow from a knob kerry club, the primitive weapon still dripping in the hands of Corporal Davies. They had 12 minutes to reach their own lines before the artillery barrage resumed. Somewhere in the darkness behind them, 17 more Germans lay dead or dying in Calonne Trench, and Grimshaw carried in his pack what the generals back at divisional headquarters had sent him to collect: identification papers, trench maps, and a leather-bound diary still warm from a dead officer's breast pocket. This was not warfare, as the world had known it. This was something older, more visceral, a return to the blade and the cudgel in an industrial age. By dawn, the British Third Army would know the exact disposition of German forces along a 3-mile sector of the Hindenburg Line. But Grimshaw, stumbling through the frozen mud with his blood-stained raiders, already understood a truth that would reshape modern warfare. In the stalemate of the trenches, victory belonged not to the army with the most artillery or the deepest reserves, but to the men willing to descend into the earth at night and kill with their hands. 3 years earlier, when the great armies of Europe first collided in Belgium and France, no general staff in the world had planned for this. The trench raid, that peculiar and terrifying form of combat that would come to define the Western Front's nighttime hours, existed nowhere in the tactical doctrine of August 1914. The war was supposed to be mobile, decisive, over by Christmas. British officers trained at Sandhurst studied the cavalry charge and the coordinated infantry assault. French military academies preached the doctrine of offensive à outrance, the attack carried to the utmost. German commanders perfected the theories of Schlieffen and von Moltke, envisioning great sweeping movements of entire army corps. None of them, not one, anticipated that their soldiers would spend 3.5 years staring at each other across a few hundred yards of cratered earth, and that the primary tactical innovation would involve sending small groups of men crawling through the darkness to murder their enemies in muddy holes. The Great War's descent into static trench warfare by the winter of 1914 created a crisis of military purpose. Along a line stretching 450 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border, millions of men occupied parallel systems of ditches, dugouts, and fortified positions, protected by barbed wire entanglements sometimes 60 feet deep, and machine gun nests positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. The mathematics of defensive warfare had overwhelmed offensive capability. A defending soldier in a prepared trench position could fire 15 aimed rifle shots per minute. A Vickers machine gun properly employed could sweep an entire field of advance with 250 rounds in the same time frame. Artillery had grown so powerful and accurate that massed infantry assaults, the cornerstone of 19th century tactics, became exercises in mass suicide. The First Battle of the Marne, the race to the sea, the slaughter at Ypres, all confirmed the same brutal calculus. Frontal assault against prepared defenses cost attackers roughly 5 casualties for every 1 inflicted on defenders. Something had to change. The trench raid emerged not from tactical innovation at headquarters, but from practical necessity at the front. In the early months of trench warfare, both sides quickly discovered that simply occupying static positions created dangerous ignorance. Who held the trench opposite your own? What was their strength, their morale, their defensive capability? Were they preparing an attack? Did they possess new weapons or defensive techniques? The traditional methods of reconnaissance, cavalry patrols, and aerial observation proved inadequate in this new environment. Cavalry could not penetrate the wire. Aircraft, still primitive in 1915, could photograph enemy trenches but could not answer the crucial questions about the men who occupied them. The only solution was to go across no man's land and take the information by force. The first raids were clumsy, improvised affairs. British and French soldiers, often acting on the initiative of junior officers or even NCOs, would crawl across no man's land before dawn, attempt to rush an enemy sentry post or listening position, and retreat with whatever prisoners or documents they could capture. These early attempts suffered appalling casualties. The raiders possessed no specialized equipment, no tactical doctrine, no training for this peculiar form of warfare. They went into battle carrying standard-issue rifles, wearing their normal uniforms, relying on surprise alone to overcome the defensive advantages of the enemy position. Most raids failed completely. Those that succeeded did so at terrible cost. A March 1915 British raid near Neuve-Chapelle sent 40 men across no man's land to capture German prisoners. 37 were killed or wounded. They returned with one stunned German private, who could tell his interrogators nothing of value. But the concept, however crude in execution, revealed possibilities. In April 1915, the Canadian Corps, newly arrived on the Western Front and stationed in the Ypres salient, began systematically developing raid tactics under the direction of officers who understood that industrial warfare required industrial solutions. They studied the problem like engineers approaching a technical challenge. What specific objectives justified the risk of human life? How could raiders move across no man's land without detection? What weapons proved most effective in the confined spaces of trench combat? How long could a raiding party remain in enemy trenches before counterattack became inevitable? The Canadians, many of them frontiersmen and miners in civilian life, approached trench raiding with a practical ruthlessness that would soon make them the most feared raiders on the Western Front. January 10th, 1917. Calonne sector, Western Front, 6 miles northeast of Arras. The temperature hovered just below freezing as Lieutenant Arthur Grimshaw assembled his raiding party in a reserve trench 300 yards behind the British front line. 20 men, volunteers all, hand-picked from 3 different companies of the 8th Battalion, Durham Light Infantry. They had trained for this mission for 6 days, a lifetime in trench warfare time. Each man carried specialized equipment that would have bewildered a soldier of 1914. Knobkerries, wooden clubs, studded with metal, designed for silent killing in confined spaces. Mills bombs, the egg-shaped hand grenades that had become the raiders' primary weapon, wire cutters, electric torches, blank cartridges to signal success or emergency, first aid supplies, and peculiar canvas bags filled with sand, used to muffle the sound of footsteps on duckboards. They wore dark clothing over their uniforms, fabric blackened with mud and charcoal. Their faces were smeared with a paste of dirt and oil, making recognition impossible even at close range. Standard-issue boots had been replaced with rubber-soled shoes or thick woolen socks, allowing them to move silently across the frozen ground. Most had removed their helmets, finding them too reflective and noisy for night work, replacing them with dark wool caps, or going bareheaded entirely. Each man had sewn identifying white patches onto the shoulders of his tunic, visible only from above, allowing British machine gunners and sentries to distinguish returning raiders from German counterattackers in the darkness. They looked less like soldiers of a modern army, and more like medieval bandits preparing for a night assault on a rival stronghold. Grimshaw himself was 24 years old, a former schoolteacher from Durham who had enlisted in August 1914 with romantic notions of military glory. 3 years of trench warfare had stripped away whatever illusions he had brought to France. He had survived the Somme offensive of 1916, had seen entire battalions dissolve under German artillery fire, had learned that modern war consisted primarily of mud, monotony, and sudden death. The trench raid represented something different, a form of combat where individual initiative and courage still mattered, where a small group of determined men could achieve objectives impossible for entire divisions in frontal assault. It was dangerous work, perhaps the most dangerous on the Western Front. Casualty rates for raiding parties routinely exceeded 50%, but it offered something the daily grind of trench routine could not: purpose, action, the sense that one's fate remained, at least partially, in one's own hands. The objective for tonight's raid had come down from 3rd Army headquarters 5 days earlier. German forces, opposite the British positions near Calonne, had recently been reinforced, possibly indicating preparation for a spring offensive. Army intelligence required identification of the new units, assessment of their strength and disposition, and, if possible, capture of trench maps or operational orders. Aerial reconnaissance had identified a section of enemy trench, designated on British maps as Calonne Trench, that appeared vulnerable to night attack. The German wire at this point had been partially destroyed by British artillery fire in December. The distance across no man's land measured only 180 yards, close enough to reach quickly but far enough that British artillery could lay down a covering barrage without endangering the raiders. Most importantly, German listening posts in this sector had been observed following predictable patterns, their sentries rotating every 2 hours like clockwork. The plan required precision timing. At precisely 11:45 post-meridium, British artillery would begin a 5-minute bombardment of German positions 200 yards north and south of Calonne Trench, drawing attention away from the actual target. At 11:50, the bombardment would intensify, with high explosive shells falling on German communication trenches and support positions. At exactly midnight, all artillery fire would cease. In the sudden silence, Grimshaw's 20 raiders would cross no man's land, penetrate Calonne Trench, gather intelligence, capture prisoners if possible, and withdraw to British lines. Total time allocated for the raid: 14 minutes. British artillery would resume firing at 12:14 ante-meridium, regardless of whether the raiders had returned, sealing off German reinforcements, but also trapping any British soldiers still in enemy territory. 14 minutes to cross 180 yards of mud and wire, enter an enemy trench system, fight the garrison, locate and secure intelligence materials, capture prisoners, and return. 14 minutes during which anything could go wrong. Any unexpected resistance could prove fatal. Any hesitation could strand men in German trenches when the British barrage resumed. Every man in Grimshaw's raiding party understood the mathematics of the situation. They also understood they had volunteered anyway, because refusing to volunteer, showing fear or reluctance, violated the unwritten code that governed life at the front. You went when called. You did your job. You trusted the men beside you to do theirs. And if you died knowing you had done what was expected. The British bombardment began exactly on schedule. Grimshaw, crouched in the forward trench with his raiders, felt the ground shake as 18-pounders and howitzers opened fire on German positions. The sound was physically painful, a continuous rolling thunder that made speech impossible and thought difficult. High explosive shells screamed overhead, their passage marked by a distinctive tearing sound that every frontline soldier learned to recognize. 200 yards to the north and south, German trenches erupted in fountains of earth and shattered timber as British shells found their targets. Grimshaw checked his watch by the light of a shaded torch. 11:48. 2 minutes. He looked at his raiders. their blackened faces expressionless in the darkness, and felt a surge of something that might have been affection or might have been grief. Some of these men would be dead in an hour, perhaps all of them, perhaps himself. The bombardment intensified. Now the shells fell further back, hitting German communication trenches and dugouts, preventing reinforcement of the forward positions. Grimshaw raised his hand, preparing to give the signal. The raiders tensed, gripping their weapons. 11:59, 30 seconds. The night had become a continuous explosion, light and sound merging into something beyond sensory comprehension. Grimshaw's hand dropped. The raiders scrambled up and over the parapet, dropping into no man's land as the barrage continued to rage on either side of them. Midnight. Silence. The sudden absence of artillery fire was more shocking than its presence had been. Grimshaw's ears rang in the quiet as he scrambled forward across frozen mud, his rubber-soled shoes finding purchase on the uneven ground. Around him, his raiders moved like ghosts, spread out in a skirmish line, each man responsible for his sector. The distance across no man's land had seemed insignificant on maps. Now, crawling through the darkness with every nerve screaming warnings about German machine guns, it felt infinite. Grimshaw could hear his own breathing, harsh and rapid, despite his attempts at control. 60 yards. 90. The German wire appeared ahead, dark strands barely visible against the night sky. He angled toward the gap identified by reconnaissance, praying the intelligence had been accurate, praying German engineers had not repaired the breach during the past week. The wire had not been repaired. Grimshaw slipped through the gap, feeling barbs catch at his clothing, hearing the faint scrape of metal on fabric. Behind him his raiders followed, moving with trained efficiency through the obstacle. They had rehearsed this crossing in British trenches, practicing on replica wire obstacles until they could navigate them blindfolded. Now the training paid dividends as 20 men slipped through German defences without triggering an alarm. 120 yards crossed in 4 minutes. Grimshaw felt a momentary surge of triumph, immediately suppressed. The wire had been the easy part. The German trench appeared suddenly, a dark slash in the earth just ahead. Grimshaw heard voices, German soldiers talking in low tones, their words incomprehensible but their tone unmistakable. Bored, tired, discussing the British bombardment with the weary cynicism of men who had endured such things before. They had no idea death had arrived in their trench. Grimshaw raised his hand, signalling his raiders to positions on either side of him. 6 men would drop into the trench and move north, 6 would move south. The remaining 8, including Grimshaw, would provide covering fire and handle prisoners. He pulled a Mills bomb from his belt, waiting for the synchronized moment when all raiders would attack simultaneously. The explosion of the grenades marked the end of discussion and the beginning of slaughter. Grimshaw dropped into the German trench immediately after his bomb detonated, his revolver extended, firing at shadows that screamed and fell. Around him, his raiders descended like furies, clubs and bayonets rising and falling in the darkness. The Germans fought back with desperate courage, but surprise and violence overwhelmed them. A German soldier lunged at Grimshaw with a rifle, the bayonet passing so close to his face that he felt its wind. Corporal Davies materialized from nowhere and struck the German in the skull with his knobkerrie, the sound of impact wet and final. The German collapsed without a sound. The fighting lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, Calonne Trench belonged to the British. Grimshaw counted bodies as his raiders systematically searched the position. 18 Germans dead or dying, 3 wounded prisoners, their hands bound with wire. And everywhere, the materials of intelligence, papers, documents, maps, diaries, letters. Grimshaw's men gathered everything, stuffing their packs with whatever seemed valuable, working with frantic efficiency. 7 minutes had elapsed since they crossed no man's land. 7 minutes remaining before the British barrage resumed. A German counterattack materialized from a communication trench to the south. Grimshaw heard the distinctive sound of German voices raised in alarm and command. He fired 2 blank cartridges into the air, the signal for immediate withdrawal, and his raiders began scrambling back over the parapet into no man's land. The wounded German prisoners went with them, dragged and carried by men who understood their intelligence value. Behind them, German rifle fire opened up, bullets cracking through the darkness. But the raiders were already moving, racing back toward British lines with their captured materials and prisoners. Grimshaw was the last man out of Calonne trench. He fired his revolver blindly back at the approaching Germans, more to delay than to hit, and then vaulted over the parapet. His foot caught on something, probably a corpse, and he fell heavily into the mud. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent his revolver spinning away into darkness. German bullets snapped overhead as he struggled to his feet, disoriented, trying to locate his own lines. A hand grabbed his collar and hauled him forward. Sergeant Williams, a coal miner from Newcastle, his face invisible beneath its coating of mud and lampblack. Together they stumbled toward British lines, following the other raiders who had already reached the wire. They made it through the gap with 30 seconds to spare. The British barrage resumed at precisely 12:14 ante-meridium, high explosive shells falling on Calonne trench and the surrounding area with mathematical precision. Grimshaw collapsed in the British trench, his heart hammering, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Around him, his raiders counted off. 19 men. 1 missing. Private Saunders, last seen fighting in the southern section of Calonne trench. Probably dead, possibly wounded, and captured. The arithmetic of trench raiding, 95% return rate. 1 casualty. Complete success. The intelligence haul from the Calonne raid exceeded Third Army's expectations. Among the captured documents were complete defensive plans for a 2-mile sector of the German line, identification papers confirming the recent arrival of 3 fresh German divisions from the Eastern Front, and, most valuable of all, annotated maps showing German artillery positions and ammunition dumps. The 3 wounded prisoners, interrogated by intelligence officers, provided information about German morale, supplies, and expectations for the spring campaign season. Within 48 hours, British artillery had begun targeting the newly identified German positions. Within a week, Third Army had adjusted its own defensive plans based on knowledge of German deployments and intentions. The Calonne raid represented trench raiding at its most effective, but it was hardly unique. By early 1917, the British Army alone was conducting an average of 4 major raids per week along its sector of the Western Front, each raid involving between 15 and 100 men, each designed to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, or disrupt German defensive preparations. The Canadian Corps, whose systematic development of raid tactics had pioneered the technique, conducted raids with almost industrial frequency, sometimes launching multiple raids per night along different sections of their front. The Australians, arriving in France in 1916, took to trench raiding with enthusiasm, developing a fearsome reputation for aggression and tactical innovation. The French, initially skeptical of the technique, eventually adopted it after witnessing British success. Even the Germans, primarily defensive-minded on the Western Front while focusing offensive efforts in the East, began conducting retaliatory raids against Allied positions. The development of specialized raiding equipment and tactics transformed what had begun as desperate improvisation into a sophisticated form of warfare. By 1917, armies on both sides maintained dedicated raiding battalions, units specially trained and equipped for night operations. Raiders trained in mock trenches built behind the lines, practicing with live ammunition and explosives until every movement became instinctive. They studied aerial photographs of target trenches, memorizing layouts and identifying objectives. They rehearsed withdrawal routes until they could navigate them in complete darkness. The casualty rate remained high, routinely exceeding 30% for major raids, but the intelligence value justified the cost in a war where information about enemy intentions could mean the difference between repelling an attack and suffering catastrophic breakthrough. The psychological impact of trench raiding extended far beyond its immediate tactical results. German soldiers stationed opposite active raiding sectors lived in constant fear of night attack. The knowledge that at any moment British or Canadian or Australian raiders might appear in the darkness, armed with grenades and clubs, created a climate of permanent tension. German commanders responded by increasing night patrols, reinforcing forward positions, and implementing elaborate alarm systems. These defensive measures required manpower and resources, tying down troops who might otherwise have been used for offensive operations. More subtly, the constant threat of raids eroded morale and cohesion, making German soldiers jumpy, trigger-happy, exhausted by interrupted sleep and perpetual vigilance. The raiders themselves occupied a peculiar position in the social hierarchy of trench warfare. They were volunteers, men who had chosen to accept extraordinary danger in exchange for something difficult to articulate: adventure, glory, relief from boredom, proving themselves to their comrades. Many raiders came from working-class backgrounds: coal miners and factory workers and agricultural laborers who possessed the physical toughness and practical skills that raiding demanded. Others were middle-class soldiers like Grimshaw, men seeking purpose in a war that had reduced most combat to passive endurance of artillery bombardment. All of them shared certain characteristics: aggression, initiative, willingness to kill at close quarters, ability to function under extreme stress. They were, in effect, the special forces of their era, an elite within an army of millions. Lieutenant Arthur Grimshaw conducted 7 more trench raids between January and August 1917. He survived them all, though not unchanged. The man who returned from the Calonne raid, his uniform spattered with German blood, his pack stuffed with captured documents, had crossed a psychological boundary that could never be uncrossed. He had killed men with his hands, had watched Corporal Davies cave in a German soldier's skull with a club, had dragged wounded prisoners across no man's land while their comrades fired at him from the darkness. These experiences existed outside the framework of conventional morality, existing in a space where survival and mission accomplishment were the only values that mattered. In August 1917, Grimshaw was promoted to captain and transferred to a staff position at divisional headquarters, his raiding days over. He survived the war, returned to England in 1919, resumed his teaching career in Durham. He never spoke publicly about his experiences as a raider. His diary, discovered after his death in 1957, provides one of the most detailed accounts of trench raiding from a participant's perspective. The entry describing the Calonne raid ends with a single line: "Brought back 17 sets of identification papers and 3 prisoners. Saunders did not return. I do not know if this was worth one man's life. I do not know if anything is." The transformation of warfare, represented by trench raiding, extended far beyond the Western Front or the First World War. The techniques developed in the muddy trenches of France and Belgium, the emphasis on surprise, speed, violence of action, and immediate withdrawal, became the foundation for modern special operations doctrine. The British commandos of the Second World War traced their lineage directly to the trench raiders of 1915 through 1918. The American Rangers, the German Fallschirmjäger, the Soviet assault engineers all owed intellectual debts to the men who had pioneered night assault tactics in the First World War. The fundamental insight that small groups of highly trained soldiers could achieve objectives impossible for larger conventional forces shaped military thinking throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. But the deeper legacy of trench raiding involved questions about the nature of warfare itself. The trench raid represented a return to ancient forms of combat, hand-to-hand fighting with primitive weapons, in the midst of the most technologically advanced war in human history. This paradox that modern industrial warfare created conditions where success required reverting to the club and the knife revealed something fundamental about the relationship between technology and violence. The machine gun and the artillery piece had made traditional battle impossible, but they could not eliminate the need for men willing to close with the enemy and fight face to face. Technology created distance. Human will closed it again. The First World War began with cavalry charges and ended with tanks and aircraft. But its most characteristic form of combat involved men crawling through darkness to murder each other in muddy holes. 60 years after the Calonne raid, a researcher interviewing veterans of the Durham Light Infantry encountered a man in his 80s who had served in Grimshaw's raiding party. The old soldier, dying of emphysema in a Newcastle hospital, remembered that January night with absolute clarity. He remembered the silence when the bombardment stopped. He remembered the weight of the mill's bombs on his belt. He remembered dropping into the German trench and seeing a young soldier, probably not yet 20 years old, staring at him with absolute terror. He remembered killing that soldier with his bayonet, the resistance of flesh and cloth and leather, the smell of blood and cordite and human waste. And he remembered Grimshaw, their lieutenant, gathering captured papers while German corpses lay at his feet, working with calm efficiency as if this were normal, as if any of this could ever be normal. "We thought we were doing something important," the old soldier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought the intelligence we gathered would save lives, would help win the war. And maybe it did. Maybe those papers from Calonne prevented a German breakthrough, saved thousands of British soldiers. Or maybe it was all meaningless, just another night of killing in a war full of killing. I have thought about it for 60 years, and I still do not know. I only know that I can still see that German boy's face, the way he looked at me before I killed him. I see it when I close my eyes. I will see it until I die." He died 3 days after that interview, taking with him memories of a form of warfare that, for all its tactical sophistication and strategic importance, remained fundamentally about men killing other men in darkness. The trench raid, that most characteristic innovation of the First World War, revealed a truth about human conflict that no amount of technological advancement has yet erased. That war, however modern its weapons, however rational its strategic calculus, ultimately comes down to individual human beings inflicting violence on other individual human beings. The raiders of January 1917, crawling through mud and wire to fight with clubs and knives, understood this truth in ways that generals studying maps could never fully comprehend. They had descended into the earth and discovered, waiting for them in the darkness, something older than nation-states or military doctrine or political ideology. They had discovered war in its most elemental form, stripped of everything except fear and courage and the terrible intimacy of killing. The trenches are gone now, ploughed under or preserved as monuments, the mud and wire and blood absorbed back into French and Belgian soil. But the legacy of the trench raiders endures, not in monuments or memorials, but in the continued existence of military units that trace their heritage to those desperate nights between 1915 and 1918, when Special Forces soldiers today rehearse close-quarters combat, or practice night infiltration, or study the art of the raid. They follow in footsteps first made in the mud of the Western Front. The men who perfected these techniques, soldiers like Arthur Grimshaw and the raiders of the Durham Light Infantry, could not have imagined how far their innovations would reach or how long their methods would endure. They were simply trying to survive, to complete their missions, to get themselves and their comrades back to friendly lines before the barrage resumed. That they succeeded, that they developed techniques and tactics that would influence warfare for more than a century, stands as testament not to any grand vision or strategic genius, but to the ingenuity of ordinary soldiers confronting extraordinary circumstances. They went into the darkness because someone had to go, because the alternative was ignorance and defeat, because their courage and their willingness to descend into hell bought time and intelligence and perhaps victory. Whether that victory justified the cost, whether anything could justify what they were asked to do and what they became in doing it, remains a question without answer. hanging in the darkness between trenches, waiting for judgment that will never come.